Yes, Sam.
In March 1859, a 36-year-old farmer signed a remarkable document in a courthouse in St. Louis, Missouri.
I, Ulysses S. Grant, do hereby emancipate and set free from slavery my Negro man William.
The former Army captain was in the midst of grinding financial struggles, and a slave was a valuable piece of property. Yet Ulysses S. Grant was freeing the only slave he ever owned.
Good luck, William. Thank you, sir.
Within 10 years, Grant would become the general who won the Civil War, and then the 18th President of the United States. When other Union generals refused African-American soldiers, General Grant valued their contributions. When many in both North and South turned away from African-American equality, President Grant kept fighting for civil rights. But even in 1859, before anyone had heard of U.S. Grant, the man who would become a great general was already something more. A man of courage and principle. He was born Hiram Ulysses Grant in the Ohio village of Point Pleasant in 1822, the son of a tanner, oldest of 6 children. At 17, he left home for the U.S. Military Academy. At West Point, his name was mistakenly listed as Ulysses S. Grant, and the mistake stuck. He graduated in the middle of his class in 1843 and was assigned to Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis. Soon he was invited to Whitehaven, the nearby home of Fred Dent, his West Point roommate. The family patriarch was Colonel Dent, a loud defender of the Southern way of life, who owned 30 slaves. Grant's attraction to Whitehaven was soon obvious. The 18-year-old Julia Dent.
I'm going to see my family soon, and I wanted to know if you wanted my class ring.
As we sat on the piazza alone, he took his class ring from his finger and asked me if I would not wear it.
I don't think my mom would approve.
Julia did not think of him in a romantic way.
The gentleman giving me gifts.
But even at 22, Ulysses exhibited the persistence that would later win a war. In 1844, when his unit was ordered to the field, Grant rode to see Julia, possibly for the last time.
Life would be insupportable without you.
Please take my ring also, to remind you.
He'll write every day.
This time, they were secretly engaged. Then Lieutenant Grant went off to war. The war was with Mexico, fought over the disputed territory of Texas. Grant became a regimental quartermaster, responsible for food, clothing, and ammunition.
I need it first thing in the morning. Corporal is there.
Throughout his military career, Grant would make sure his men would never lack the tools of war. He was a good soldier, but he kept an independent mind, with deep feelings for justice. He would later reflect,
I regard the war as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. It was a conspiracy to acquire territory out of which slave states might be formed for the American Union.
In Mexico, the young lieutenant deeply missed Julia and shared his feelings with her.
I often take the ring which bears your name from my finger, and I think of the day I first wore it.
In 4 years, he saw her only once, but their love remained constant. With the war over, they married in St. Louis in 1848. Their first child was born 2 years later at Whitehaven. But Army life soon divided the family. Grant, who wanted most of all to be a father and a husband, found himself stationed on the distant coast of Northern California.
My dear wife, you do not know how forsaken I feel here. I feel as if I have been separated from you long enough. How very much I want to see all of you.
These were lonely, moody years. In 1854, he was accused of being inebriated on duty. He soon resigned. Was it a forced resignation? The record is unclear. Years later, he would be dogged by rumors of heavy drinking. False allegations that tarnished his reputation. Back at Whitehaven, he spent 6 years working one occupation after another. He farmed, cut firewood, sold real estate, and was a rent
We had to
collector.
collect the rent.
None of these endeavors brought him success.
I'll be back in 2 weeks.
I must leave, he finally said. I can't make a go of it here. In 1860, Grant, Julia, and their 4 children moved to Galena, Illinois, where he worked in his father's leather goods store. But this obscure life was about to take a dazzling, almost inconceivable turn. On April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery began shelling Fort Sumter. The Civil War was on. Grant wrote to his slave-holding father-in-law, "In all of this, I can but see the doom of slavery." For 4 years, North and South would wage civil war. Hundreds of thousands would perish. When war erupted in 1861, Grant wanted to fight for his country. He received a commission as colonel of volunteers and then was quickly promoted to brigadier general. In the East, the Union suffered a series of defeats. A string of Union generals practiced caution, doubt, and delay. But in the West, one obscure general was entirely willing to fight. Grant got his chance in early 1862 at Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River in Tennessee. Grant was outnumbered, his enemy entrenched. Grant's commander, Henry Halleck, sent instructions. Stop. Wait. But Grant would not wait. He drew up his army around the fort. On the icy morning of February 15th, Confederate forces stormed out of the fort. Grant was surprised, but made a characteristic response. Counterattack. His men swarmed over the fort's outer defenses, making the Confederate positions hopeless. The rebel commander, General Simon Buckner, asked what terms Grant would require.
No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works.
Within hours, a Confederate force of some 13,000 men surrendered. The Union had its first great victory. For the first time, President Lincoln and the country heard the name Ulysses S. Grant. In the spring of 1862, another Confederate attack surprised Grant. This time at Shiloh, rebel soldiers came bursting out of the woods with Grant's troops still in their tents. The result was devastating.
The open field was so covered with dead that it would have been possible to walk across the clearing in any direction, stepping only on dead bodies without a foot touching the ground.
The next day, it was Grant's turn. His attack caught the enemy by surprise and drove the Confederates into retreat. The battle had been costly on both sides. More men died at Shiloh than in all of America's previous wars combined. The nation was in shock, but the Union dead had not fallen in vain. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, freeing slaves in Confederate states and territories. Thousands of African Americans volunteered to fight for the Union. Unlike some Union generals, Grant welcomed the freed men. "We've added a powerful ally," he wrote. Grant's star rose high in 1863. That summer, he captured an entire Confederate army at Vicksburg, giving the Union control of the Mississippi. That fall, his victory at Chattanooga opened the way for an invasion of the South. The modest Ulysses S. Grant was now the Union's greatest hero. In March 1864, Lincoln named him commanding general of all Union armies. Promising to soon end the war, Grant oversaw the campaign in Virginia against Robert E. Lee. For a year, the two great generals fought it out in a series of monumental struggles. Lee struck first, attacking in the nightmarish Battle of the Wilderness, where the armies clashed at close quarters. Losses were staggering, but Grant kept moving forward. "There will be no turning back," he said. Slowly, Grant pursued and broke down Lee's army. In the spring of 1865, the former quartermaster made the final tactical stroke. He cut the starving Confederates off from their supplies. On April 9th, Grant and Lee met at Appomattox Courthouse. Grant wrote out the terms of surrender. The South was not to be humiliated. No Confederate soldier who surrendered would be sent to prison. The Southerners could go home, keep their horses, and would even be given rations. "The war is over," Grant said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." Grant was the Union's greatest hero, but for many, his compassion at war's end was his finest hour. Just 5 days later, Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater. The beginning of the era called Reconstruction would be overseen by President Andrew Johnson, a Southerner who had himself owned slaves. Over the next 3 years, General Grant and President Johnson became bitter enemies. Both wanted reconciliation with the South, but Johnson favored white supremacy. "This country is for white men," Johnson said. "And by God, as long as I am president, it shall be governed by white men." Ulysses S. Grant had a different vision for America, a dream of justice and equality. In 1868, the Republican Party unanimously chose Grant as their presidential candidate. Activist Frederick Douglass, like most African Americans, was delighted. "I see in General Grant the vigilant and wise protector of my race," he said.
It will be my endeavor to administer all the laws with the view of giving peace, quiet, and protection everywhere. Let us have peace.
The election was no contest. Grant took all but 8 states. At 46, he was at the time the youngest president ever elected. As president, Grant's great task was to put Lincoln's beliefs into practice, reconstructing the shattered country so that it was truly dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. For Grant, the central issue was the civil rights of African Americans. Before Grant took office, congressional passage of the 15th Amendment had stalled. The measure would give African American men the right to vote and hold office. 3/4 of the states were needed to ratify the amendment. The new president worked tirelessly towards this goal. In March 1870, it became part of the U.S. Constitution.
The adoption of the 15th Amendment completes the greatest civil change and constitutes the most important political event that has occurred since the nation came into life.
But the enemies of equality refused to surrender their power. They gathered into secret societies bent on restoring white supremacy. The White Leagues and the Ku Klux Klan donned white robes and hoods, burned crosses, and rode in bands at night, burning black schools, beating teachers, kidnapping, and murdering. Grant was still the master of the counterattack. He pushed through legislation giving the federal government the power to fight the Klan.
The national government has the duty of putting forth all its energies for the protection of its citizens of every race and color, for the restoration of peace throughout the entire country.
Grant's handling of African American rights became the central issue of the 1872 presidential campaign. He won re-election in a landslide. But his second term would be blighted by negative headlines and a severe economic depression that lasted for years. Scandals erupted. Grant himself was innocent, but he was slow in removing the guilty from office. His popularity declined, and with it, his ability to defend African American rights. Racist violence surged in the South. On April 13, 1873, a paramilitary force of 300 armed white men attacked a Louisiana courthouse. These mobs killed over 100 African Americans in what became known as the Colfax Massacre. The next year, racism triggered another armed insurrection. An army of 3,500 white leaguers stormed the New Orleans State House, killed 11 U.S. soldiers, and wounded more than 60 others. They replaced the state government with one of their own.
I have repeatedly and earnestly entreated the people of the South to live together in peace and obey the laws. Treat the Negro as a citizen and as a voter as he is and must remain. It is the duty of the government to protect life and civil rights.
The president sent an army of 5,000 federal troops, accompanied by gunboats, to New Orleans. He was establishing a precedent. The commander-in-chief could use armed force to defend civil rights. Yet Grant was swimming against the current. African Americans would be abandoned as Grant's term came to a close. Soon after, Reconstruction ended as federal troops were withdrawn from the South. In 1877, with his public life finally over, Julia and he settled down quietly in Manhattan. But in 1884, his comfortable retirement evaporated. A disreputable partner had swindled the former president out of his entire fortune. That same year, he picked up a peach, bit into it, and felt intense pain in his throat. It was the first sign of cancer. Ulysses Grant was dying.
Do you have any trouble swallowing?
He now faced his final battle, providing for his suddenly impoverished family. Mark Twain offered to publish Grant's memoirs, if the ailing Grant could finish them. Despite searing pain, he wrote a 2-volume book in less than a year. The memoirs sold 300,000 sets. It ensured his family's future and created an abiding literary classic. On July 23, 1885, just days after finishing his memoirs, the former general and president died peacefully at the age of 63. Both North and South grieved. More than 1 million people lined the streets of New York to pay tribute to the man who had saved the Union and led the struggle for equality. 12 years later, his remains were placed in a mausoleum on the banks of the Hudson River. But Grant's greatest work remained unfinished.
It is possible that the conflict between races may come up in the future. The condition of the colored man may become a source of anxiety, but he was brought to our shores by compulsion, and he now should be considered to have as good a right to remain here as any other.
Grant had greatly helped African Americans in their struggle for freedom, but equality slipped away once again. For a century, the full rights of Americans were for whites only. Almost a century later, presidents would send armed troops into the South to secure justice. they would push through legislation that guaranteed civil rights for all. Ulysses S. Grant had employed these same tactics in the 1870s. Over the years, his greatness would be buried. For over a century, the common story of Grant was that the great general was a failure as a president. But Grant, the impoverished farmer who freed his only slave in 1859, continued to work for justice throughout his life. It was not Grant who failed, but a country that was not yet ready to protect civil rights for everyone. Today, Grant's belief in equality is embraced by the American people and protected by American law. Ulysses S. Grant will always be celebrated as the general who led the Union to victory in the Civil War. But he shall also be remembered as the president who laid the foundation of civil rights for all.
The Grant family lived here for about 5.5 years, but when they lived here permanently, Grant was actually a farmer before he would get famous here. So when we inside, guys, so you have to put a mask on. We'll go outside with the mask off. So let's go outside. So the Whitehaven home is part of the greater property. Now in the Park Service, we have about 9.5 acres. You see it's all fenced in around here. So back then, you're in the middle of a large 850 acres of land here owned by Mrs. Grant's family, the Dent family here. The home itself was built in 1812 to 1816, so the home is over 200 years old, but there were some additions added to the home during the lifetime of Ulysses S. Grant. So the Dent family mainly farmed here. So Colonel Dent, Julia's father, was a Maryland merchant who came out to become a gentleman farmer in Missouri, mainly growing wheat and corn, various vegetable gardens, as well as food orchards were here, but it was still a heavily rural property. Now, of course, it was surrounded by the county metropolitan area. Back then, it was about 12 miles to downtown St. Louis. And so, basically, we're in the middle of the boondocks at the time. But Missouri enters the Union not long after the house is built as a slave state, and slaves are actually going to be here throughout the Dent ownership of the property. In fact, in 1850, the Dents owned 30 enslaved African Americans. 10 years later, they owned 7. And so the last slave, according to Mrs. Grant, Julia, the slave ran away or walked off the property in 1864, which was the end of the Civil War. So Ulysses Grant actually was not from St. Louis. He was from Ohio, and he grows up in a rather anti-slavery family. So the sheer act of him marrying into Julia's family, marrying Julia, and living here before the war shows that he's kind of going to be caught in between the sexual difficulties of the country within his own personal family relationships. So later on, of course, he will be committed to the Union cause, and the same with Julia. And he will eventually enter the Army again during the Civil War and rise to the level of Lieutenant General during the war. And he's the nation's first ever 4-star general after the war. After the war, also, he changes his property because Grant buys the property from his father-in-law and brothers-in-law, so he becomes the owner of Whitehaven. And instead of farming here, Grant's going to raise and breed racehorses. So the stables over here was added when Grant was president, but this is part of his addition to the home. At one time, a newspaper clipping had 20 horses inside that building. Now it's our museum. So let's go up towards the house, guys. Anybody have any questions for the layout of the land? Oh, he goes, and he's going to muster up the courage to ask her to marry him. But apparently the day he comes, it's a day kind of like this. It's been raining a lot, no bridge. He just plunges into the creek, and he says he fell off his horse. And he had to maintain grip on the horse to keep him going downstream till he gets across the creek and ends up showing up here soaking wet. Has to borrow Julia's brother, who was about 5 inches taller than him, his clothes. So he kind of looked like a kind of comical sight, I guess you could say. But he got the job done, persistent as ever. By the end of the stay here, he asked Julia to marry him right there on the front porch of this house. So he got what he wanted to get to accomplish here. But he was from Ohio. Like I said, his father ran a tannery business, and Grant hated that kind of work. His father also had a connection to a local congressman. This congressman got Ulysses appointed to West Point, the U.S. Military Academy, where Grant graduates in the middle of his class in 1843. One of his classmates is Julia's older brother, Fred, and also a future Union general as well. And that friendship, and Grant being stationed in St. Louis upon graduation, brings Ulysses up to this property as potential entertainers. Julia remembers her parents entertaining politicians, merchants, wealthy people, and army officers from Jefferson Barracks. So, yeah, so this house kind of hopping, I guess you can say, back when Mrs. Grant was growing up, because the Dent family wanted to show off their wealth. But Ulysses, Julia's father, did not see Ulysses as a potential husband for his daughter. Apparently he was against the match for a little while. So when Ulysses goes off to the Mexican War, he gets engaged, but it's a secret engagement. And so it won't be a year until Colonel Dent does find out. And he does eventually accept it. When Ulysses gets back to the Mexican War, the two will get married in another Dent home in the city, actually. And so, interesting enough, while the Dents host the wedding, Ulysses' parents and siblings don't even come down for this. So you see the differences of the Dents and Grant evident in their wedding. Later on, Grant's father's on record of saying, calling the Dent family a tribe of staples. But Julia would have grown up here, and being an army wife, of course, was a kind of something as a life of hardship. And so she was much more comfortable here because this is where she grew up, things were taken care of for her. And so Ulysses and Julia did move a little bit in the army, but eventually Ulysses is sent way out to the Pacific West Coast. Julia decides to raise the two oldest boys here. Ulysses is away from his family for 2 years. Eventually, he decides to resign from the military. Captain Grant quits the army, resigns, and moves back to St. Louis to become a farmer and help manage the property that's under the ownership of Julie's parents. So that starts his 5 years of living here. He takes advantage of about 80 acres, actually. So when they got married, Colonel Dent set aside 80 acres for the family to kind of start his own farm and start his own house. And Grant actually is going to take advantage of that, build his own cabin up there. Took him about a year and a half to build. It was about a mile up that road. That cabin still exists across the street when the Busch family bought that property, and they moved that cabin over there. But Julia names it Hardscrabble. She, of course, had a much more better experience in this house than she ever had in Hardscrabble because the family lived there for 3 months. And they moved back to Whitehaven, where Julia's...
The one that shows down there in Gravois?
Correct, yeah, right off Gravois Road. Originally, it was about a mile that way. That's where Grant built it originally.
Okay. And they did live there for
They lived there for 3 months.
Oh.
3 months, actually, from October of 1856 to January of 1857. So Julia's mother dies in January of 57, and so the Grants moved from Hardscrabble back here while Grant's father-in-law had to utilize Grant's help in helping to manage the property, the farming, the books, but also the enslaved people here. So Grant takes a more of an active role in helping the day-to-day management of Whitehaven, but it's also very unlucky for the Grant. Farming was something he enjoyed doing, but he was never really successful in it. So year after year, the harvest was underwhelming. He'd be cutting firewood and hauling firewood up to St. Louis and street corners sometimes. And so life was hard, but Grant had to deal with adversity, deal with challenges, and try to find different solutions to different problems. And that ability to kind of adapt to changing situations eventually is going to make him successful, not as a farmer, but of course as a general. But he's very innovative in the Civil War. But here he's also living through a time period. The United States is very divided. He's dealing with a pro-Southern father-in-law who actually is going to speak the Southern way of life and defend it vocally. While Ulysses' father, of course, would not lend him a hand helping him with the farm, despite Grant asked his father for some loans and things like that, and no money comes from Ulysses' father. So again, he's kind of caught on a tug-of-war situation between the two families for a little bit, but he is living through those important events that we all heard of, heading towards the Civil War in Missouri, which was a very divided state. Well, he also finds brief employment in the city in real estate and rent collecting. Besides farming, he doesn't really find a permanent full-time job here. His father kept asking him to come up to Illinois because his father had opened a tannery store there, and Ulysses had two younger brothers that were working in the store, and one was dying of tuberculosis. And so they were constantly referring to Grant to get up there and help out. He tried to skirt it as long as he could, but when he was rejected for his application of running for St. Louis County engineer, Ulysses basically had nothing else. He had freed his only slave, William Jones, that he got from the Dent family. We don't know how long he had him, but of course, selling him could have got Ulysses some money, but he did not sell William Jones. He also sold most of his farming equipment anyways to make extra money on hand. So he leaves St. Louis in 1860 and moves to Galena, Illinois, right about the time the picture was taken that I showed you. So there he's briefly there when his father is kind of relying on Ulysses and his brothers to run the store, and the Civil War begins. And so Ulysses literally is going to turn himself in from a struggling farmer and storekeeper to a colonel within a few months, and later rise to general and command armies and win victories. And Lincoln later says about Grant, I trust him because he fights. He does not bother me for supplies and challenges for supplies. He takes what I can give him and goes off and does his best. So with that, Grant and Lincoln kind of this really good working relationship. Lincoln's policies of transformation, Grant has to win the battlefield. And Grant becomes going to be he's going to actually agree with a lot of this transformation. He becomes anti-slavery during this time. While it takes Julie a little more time to come to grips with slavery is leaving, Grant's going to be very much a man proposing or promoting the use of African-American troops in the army to fight in the army. So literally, he's actually, his policies, military victories, are overturning the way of life that he's lived in, but also the Dent family has built their fortune on. And so the Dents are going to be going downhill financially, while Grant's going to rise in this mediocre rise to become the commanding general and later president of the United States. One man that's still alive to see Ulysses become president is going to be Colonel Dent. He dies in the White House when he lives with the Grants. He dies there when Grant was president. While Grant had a good working relationship with Abraham Lincoln, he did not with Lincoln's successor. Lincoln was shot just 5 days after Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant in Appomattox, Virginia. Johnson and Grant differed on Reconstruction, and so Ulysses is going to later actually put his hat into politics, and he will run and he will actually fight really hard for civil rights while president. So literally, what he was fighting for when he was president was 10 years earlier here on this farm was very different from Ulysses S. Grant. Also, Grant decides to buy the property because he's hoping to retire here at one point to raise horses, but he never does retire. Slowly but surely, his interest in the property begins to wane. He hires caretakers and laborers to run the farm here while he was president, and he made occasional visits. So think of this now as the Grant ownership as like a vacation home. He'll come back occasionally to visit. He does add the stables. He does also, Julia is responsible for the house changing to this Paris green color. That was her choice, and it was painted there in the middle of Grant's term as president. But it's more of a French color to the home. Ulysses and Julia embark on a world tour when he leaves the White House. They travel abroad for about 30 different countries. And when they return to the United States, instead of coming to St. Louis to be amongst his horses, he retires in New York because that's where the kids and grandkids, the majority of them, are living at the time. And he goes back into business and he gets swindled. In his last year of life, he's dying of throat cancer and really has no money to his name because he'd been swindled. So he basically paid his debts off with his property. And 3 months before he died, this property he's owned for almost 20 years, he signed it over to the Vanderbilts, who he owed a debt of over $150,000. So the Vanderbilts owned this property as Grant died, and they sold it off soon thereafterwards. But Grant wrote his memoirs, and he actually finished them. And Mark Twain, a friend that later joined him in New York, he published them, his company, and Mark Twain personally delivers a check to Julia for $200,000. And later on, the Grant family makes over $450,000 from the memoirs. So Julia does live pretty well the last 17 years. She outlives Ulysses. but she only comes back to her old Charlotte home one time. So obviously her life had moved on, and she and Ulysses are both entombed in New York today. So over time, much of the house or the property, the surrounding area has been developed. In the 1980s, there was still a family living here, actually, the Wenslicks. And a lot of people from the surrounding area felt that the house was being threatened. There were offers from developers. And so people formed a society. They called it Save Grants Whitehaven in the 80s. In 3 years, they worked on fundraising to restore the home. And they made about $510,000, and they bought the home with that money and gave it to the county. The county had it for a few years. And in 1989, the Park Service took over the property. So we're like 32 years old, actually, as a national historic site. But so we took about 2.5 years to restore the home back to when the Grants would have it. Obviously, there's a few modern things you might need in there, but it's pretty much what the rooms are used for when the Grant family once lived there. There were 4 young children, Julia's parents, and then until her mother died, and Ulysses and Julia all living together. So with that, guys, any questions before we... But everybody here, if you look, no matter where you look here, all around you, was all land that originally belonged to the President of the United States, and before that, his father-in-law.
Yeah, they were doing, I bet all these big high trees weren't here if they had didn't they grow things here?
They did, but they grew, it was heavily rural, so there was a lot of trees here when Grant was here, because he would cut up a lot of firewood, and you had each of the rooms had a fireplace, and then say people would use firewood for cooking and laundry and stuff. But most of the trees that Grant would cut are not going to be right around this house. They're down in the Grant's farm area, up in this part of the property up there. But there is one tree that's still here that was actually an eyewitness to Grant living here. There's one. There's actually a big fat tree right against the fence. It's hard to see. I'm not sure if I can see it over there, but it's against the corner of the fence. There it is. So all the way in the back of that fence, where the two fences come together, that tree was planted in 1829, and that was actually when Grant would have been 7 years old, Julia would have been 3 years old. And that was planted. So it's a black oak. It's really fat. It's like literally the furthest tree back there, the big fat trunk. That is the one witness tree we have that we know of.
Yeah.
Some are disputed, but that tree we have documented evidence that it was planted in 1829.
Yeah.
Okay, so guys, we go in the house here. The sitting room is the family room. That's closed off right now because we're rebuffering the floor. But all the rooms here, the hall of the dining room, you walk in the room. We have a short video you guys can watch inside the dining room too. It's about 2 minutes long. And after you get done with the home, I'll meet you in the back porch. I'll show you the outbuildings, guys. So let me know if you have any questions. Still roughly 60% original. So they're still pretty original.
Thanks.
We do not know which one Grant would use, but the only story we have is Julia's memoirs of some of the kids like to sleep in the balcony at summer nights. So that's it. We don't know exactly who's stepping in which room.
Yeah.
Whose favorite color was green?
This was Julia's color. She was the one that had the color painted to the house. Called Paris green. I guess it reflected more of a European, like, fashion, I guess. But it was popular in Paris, France. Watch this, guys. Paul is over here. Diamond is here. The whole video is so far. I'm going to see it. We can't, we can't go into the sitting room. We can look through that door. That's the sitting room, too. So let me know if you want to go together. Right outside the door.
Oh, sure, with the harvest time, you see, I don't have to rely on slaves, and I'll be sure to hear from your father about that.
Ulysses, our father has no right to pass judgment on us. Why, we treat our slaves like family.
Papa, don't start this argument again.
Well, these abolitionists get me all riled up with their talking about freedom for the Negro. Thank goodness for Chief Justice Tawney and the Supreme Court protecting our property with the Dred Scott case.
Tawney's decision denies the right of citizenship to all Negroes, be they free or slave. It is an extreme view. The North will not accept that.
The economy of this entire country depends on slave labor, the North as well as the South. Northern mills would shut down without Southern cotton, and without slaves, there is no cotton. The South will secede before they will abolish slavery.
That cannot be tolerated.
Ulysses, Father, can we we go one day without talking about politics?
I'm sorry, Julia. When I hear the dissolution of the Union being talked about as if it were some sort of tariff bill, it makes my blood run cold. I cannot endure the thought of the Union separating.
I do not wish to see the Union dissolved either. The Southern Democrats will not be forced into submission.
Most Northerners are only trying to stop the slavery spread into new states, not take away slaves here. The North, sir, will not abide secession.
Well, I believe you're completely...
Now both of you stop. You speak as if war were around the corner. Besides, I don't even think there's going to be a war.
She shut them up.
Yep. What is that?
They just refinished the floor.
Another room?
Yeah, there were 2 rooms in there, but they just refinished the floor. They said you can't go.
Oh, yeah, yeah.